Hi. So far in this textbook, we have looked at how students learn languages and how teachers can help students develop their skills in the language. In this chapter, we have a look at how we can judge our students' abilities before, during, or after they take part in our course. Our textbook doesn't make a clear distinction between a test and assessment, but before we go too far, it might be a good idea for us to be clear on the difference between these two words. A test is what you typically imagine your teachers giving you on paper, and you end up with a score. The quizzes we do at the beginning of class each week can be considered tests. Assessment, on the other hand, is much broader. Assessment includes when your teacher notices the way you are speaking or any mistakes you might be making in your speech. This might not end up with a score, but often helps give your teacher an indication of your language progress. Basically, a test is just one part of assessment. Our textbook isn't too concerned with the difference between these two terms, but most of what we talk about in this chapter is related to testing. Here is our schedule for today. We have fewer topics than last week, thank goodness, and I think it shouldn't take too long to get through the slides. However, I'm very interested in testing, and I may go on a bit from time to time. I'll try to keep a tight rein on it though. As always, we will start with a discussion. I want to start on a negative point, which I realize probably isn't the best place to start. But, because we are talking about assessment, and in particular testing, it really can't be avoided. I would like you to think about reasons that students don't like tests. Of course, it doesn't have to be this way, but it always ends up like this. I not only want you to think about some reasons though, I want you to think of the top 5 reasons, putting them into order, for students disliking tests. Make your list and be prepared to share them in class. I'd also like to make a list as a class. We start by looking at some standards. One of the difficulties for teachers is knowing what to teach and what to test. Our author believes that a true, authentic self-representation using the second language is shown when we are able to be our true selves while using that second language. This is rather difficult when it comes to testing though. Luckily, we do have a few standards which we can look at to help us judge students' levels. First, the Common European Framework is especially well referred to when considering proficiency standards. More than this, however, you need to be aware of the Japanese version, Sefer-J. You can have a look at the website via this QR code. We can also see the ESL standards for pre-kindergarten to grade 12. Although these are a little more focused on ESL, the 3 goals, using English to communicate in social settings, using English to achieve academically in all areas, and using English in socially and culturally appropriate ways, are definitely worth remembering. Finally, you can have a quick glance through the National Standards for Foreign Language Learning and a closer look at the 5 C's on pages 213 and 214. But I also encourage you to have a look at the goals set by the Ministry of Education in Japan. These are what you need to familiarize yourself with the most. Here is our main slide for this chapter. Here, we are going to look at some of the most important issues in language testing. We need to realize that it is pretty much impossible to directly access a person's internal language system, which would tell us their true language ability. Learners may be feeling tired or anxious or whatever. However, in order to get the best possible indication of students' abilities, there are a few hints on page 215 through to 217 to help us. First, we have reliability, where we need to ask ourselves if the students did this test on another day, would they get a similar score? If another person marked this test, would the students get similar scores? A multiple choice test is very reliable, as usually there is only one possible answer. A test in which students need to write the full word or compositions will have lower reliability because the marks can be subjective. Second, we have validity. Now we need to ask ourselves how much the test we have made reflects our lessons and our goals. If you have a lot of grammar-related test items for an English conversation class, the validity is probably going to be low. Carefully observing our students on a regular basis can help increase the validity of our tests. And finally, we have authenticity and washback. We talked about this a few chapters ago, as well as in class. Making our tests as real as possible is vital in the test-making process. Furthermore, because washback suggests the way our tests are made reflects the way our students will study, you need to think about your class goals and study strategies when you compile your tests. So now it's your turn to be critical. I've mentioned before that it is your job as a university student to criticize various opinions, but of course, back that criticism up with good reasons. I want you to think of any English tests you have taken in the past. Tests at high school, university entrance tests, tests in this class. Then, I want you to critically analyze those tests with both the good points and weak points. Write down your ideas because I'll be keen to hear what you have to say. We've discussed different thoughts about testing throughout this course, both in these videos and in class. On pages 217 to 219, we see a few more ideas to think about. Are you going to use integrative testing by linking a few units together, or just concentrate on one unit in a non-integrative approach? The author of our book suggests integrative to be better, despite it having weaknesses when it comes to reliability. This can be overcome with the use of dictations, elected imitations, grammaticality judgments, and closed tests. Check page 218 for more on these. Are you going to use direct tests, in which you clearly look at the language skill of each student, or indirect tests, in which the skill you are checking is not so obvious? Or perhaps you are more interested in performance tests, in which students are observed in authentic situations. Would you use portfolios to give a fuller overall picture of each student's progress during the course? Or perhaps you are of the opinion that tests shouldn't be for grades, but simply to improve student study habits and their learning. These are just some of many questions you need to ask yourself when it comes time to test your students. There are many different reasons for testing our students, and what we use depends on what we want to know about the students after the tests. If we want to know where they rank within the class, we use norm reference tests. But if we want to know how much they have understood in a particular chapter, we use criterion reference tests, like the quizzes I give you each week. We can also use placement tests to determine which class level a student should join, diagnostic tests to concentrate on finding our students' weaknesses, or achievement tests to see whether our students have been able to reach the objectives and goals given at the start of the course. There are a few interesting issues on pages 220 to 222 related to testing the standards. Of course, the standards we are talking about here are those we discussed earlier in this chapter. What I found most interesting, however, were the considerations in standard testing seen on page 222, especially the top one related to age. What do you think about the age of children taking proficiency tests? I have seen children as young as 6 or 7 years old taking English tests normally expected to be taken by high school students. Do you think this is a little young? I'd like to base our third discussion point on this. Do you think there should be a minimum age limit for students to take standardized English proficiency tests, or should it be left to the parents or teachers to decide? Get your opinions and ideas together and let's have a good discussion about this in class. Finally, we see a variety of standardized proficiency tests. Of course, it is important for you to know about these, but I'm not going to dwell on them in this video. Have a quick read through and familiarize yourself with the acronyms. I'm sure you know of several other such tests as well. When you become a teacher, it is likely that you will need to help your students get a strong score in some of these tests. Learning about how the tests work, perhaps even doing them yourself, will allow you to prepare your students more effectively. A few years ago, when I was working at a high school, I had a really good colleague by the name of Aki Tohei, who is now teaching at a college in Fukushima, and who I'm also lucky enough to call a good mate. Aki was giving a talk to students one morning just before the exam week, and said something that has always stuck with me.
So, why do teachers give students tests? Is it to scare their students? No. Is it to make their students feel uncomfortable? No. Is it to show their students how much they still don't know? Of course not. All good teachers want their students to succeed. These teachers give students tests to show them their strong points and weak points. They want students to understand their own learning in order to help them become more successful. A wise man once said, "You don't learn to walk by following rules. You learn by doing and by falling over." Students will always fall down while learning, but a good teacher is always there to help pick them up.
I couldn't agree more with what Professor Tohei had to say, and I hope this is the way you'll approach education and tests, both as a teacher and as a student. I'll see you in class.